Have you ever loved someone who made you feel seen right before the world told you they didn't belong beside you? David Miller, a polished CEO, had built a life so controlled, not even his own heart could interrupt it. Until one day, an ex-fiancée invited him to her engagement party and mocked him for still being alone. He could have gone quietly. Instead, he hired Claire, an artist with scuffed boots, a gentle voice, and no place in his world to pretend to be the woman who loved him. But what happens when pretend begins to feel more real than anything you've ever known? And what would you do? If the person who helped you rediscover yourself was the same one society told you to walk away from, would you protect your image or choose the one who saw through it? This isn't a story about perfection. It's about two people, broken in different ways, finding a kind of wholeness in each other if they're brave enough to hold on. If this opening stirs something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Let's begin. The city moved outside his office window, but David Miller was perfectly still. Midtown shimmered beneath the early spring haze. Glass towers, like polished teeth, lined the skyline. Inside the quiet corner office, David stood with both hands in his pockets, watching the traffic slow to a crawl below, people hurrying, phones pressed to ears, briefcases clutched like shields. He was in one of those buildings, but never quite of them. Then, his phone lit up. Unknown. Caller. No, not unknown. Julia Bennett. He let it buzz twice, 3 times. Then, against better judgment, or maybe because part of him was tired of pretending he didn't care, he answered. David, came the voice. Smooth, familiar, icy. He didn't reply at first. Still saving the world one quarterly at a time, she teased. What do you want? Julia. His tone was flat, but his knuckles tightened against his thigh. Oh, come on, she said. Don't be like that. I'm just calling to let you know. I'm getting engaged. A pause. To Ethan. She added, You remember Ethan, of course you do. He actually listens when people speak. David exhaled through his nose. Congratulations. We're having a little party next Saturday, she went on, voice dripping in mock sweetness. You're invited, of course. It'll be quite the crowd. Ethan's family is very connected. Another pause. She always knew where to press. I told them you'd probably show up alone, she continued lightly. Because, well, you always do. David didn't take the bait. He just stared out the window. You know, Julia said, her voice softening in a way that always made his guard rise. For a man so successful, you really have a terrible track record with connection. Cold, reserved, a bit of a mystery, even to yourself. That's none of your business, he said quietly. She laughed. Of course it is. You and I, David, we were something once. Maybe the only real thing you ever let happen. Or maybe just the only one you almost didn't ruin. He didn't answer. Well, she finished, her voice like the last swirl of a sharp perfume. Unless you shock us all and bring someone who can stand you longer than a dinner, I'll save you a seat. Alone. Click. The silence after the call was heavier than the city outside. David looked at his reflection in the window expensive suit, tailored to precision, tie neat, hair in place. And yet, he looked like a man who had misplaced something important a long time ago and only just realized it was gone. Later that evening, David skipped the driver and walked home. He passed a florist pulling in her display, a kid busking on the corner with a harmonica too big for his hands, a dog asleep on a stoop. The city felt louder than usual, or maybe he had stopped tuning it out. In his building's elevator, a couple laughed behind him, young, carefree. their fingers laced like they had nothing to prove. When the doors opened on the 23rd floor, he didn't step out, not right away. Instead, he leaned back against the mirrored wall, eyes closing for a beat. He remembered what Julia once said during their last argument. You don't know how to need people without resenting them for being needed. He hadn't disagreed. He'd just walked away. That night, the phone rang again. This time, it was Eleanor, his sister, his CFO, and the closest thing to family he had left. He didn't answer. He already knew what she wanted: the quarterly review, the London deal, the two headlines he was avoiding. The truth was, none of it mattered in that moment. He sat in the dark, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, a glass of untouched bourbon in his hand. What he couldn't explain, not to Eleanor, not to anyone, was the way Julia's words stuck like pins. Not because he missed her. He didn't. He missed who he thought he could be when he was with her, and that was different. But the idea of walking into that room full of money, status, and too many eyes and confirming her story, that he was still alone, still unreachable, that part stung. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, David woke early, showered, skipped breakfast, and walked again. No plan. Just let his feet guide him. A cafe near Washington Square caught his attention not because of the smell of coffee or the sound of early jazz on the speakers, but because of the woman by the window. She was sketching something, brow furrowed in quiet focus, a cup of tea cooling beside her, long coat, scuffed boots, hair tied back carelessly. There was something unbothered about her, like she didn't care who watched. He stood there for a while, outside. Something about her presence reminded him of a melody he couldn't name but once heard in a dream. Then, almost without thinking, he opened the door and stepped inside. Claire didn't look up when the door chimed. The cafe had barely filled. Morning light filtered through dusty windows, casting long streaks across the wood floor. The smell of cinnamon and paperbacks lingered in the air. She was lost in the curve of a line. A sketch of an elderly man at the next table. His hands, not his face. Hands told more of a story. Wrinkled, veined, still holding the handle of a ceramic mug like it might slip away. The man didn't notice, but the newcomer did. David stepped inside, still unsure why. Maybe it was the way she held her pencil like it mattered more than her phone, or the way the world seemed to slow around her, while his life had always been about speeding up. She wore no makeup. Her scarf was frayed, but she had that look like she knew something he hadn't learned yet. She glanced up, briefly. Their eyes met, just a flicker. Then she returned to her sketch. He ordered tea, sat at the corner table behind hers, pretended to check emails but barely tapped the screen. Minutes passed. She closed her sketchbook, reached for her tea. It was cold. David spoke before he had time to overthink it. "You didn't finish," he said. She turned slightly. "Pardon?" "The sketch." He gestured. "You left his wrist unfinished." She studied him. "You were watching." He didn't deny it. "Just a little." She held his gaze for a second longer than polite, then shrugged. "People always think hands are easy. They're not." "That why you stopped?" "No," she said. "I stopped because I ran out of paper." A faint smile curved her lips. It was more amused than warm, but it stayed with him. They didn't exchange names. But the next morning, she was there again. Same window, different sketch. He walked in again, sat again, closer this time. "You're persistent," she noted. "I'm curious," he replied. "I've been called worse." What's the best thing you've been called? She thought for a moment. Kind. Then, another silence. It wasn't awkward. It was full. By the third morning, it was raining, the kind that draped the city in a veil of silver. Claire didn't sketch. She was reading, a worn paperback half hidden under the table. David sat across from her without asking. Still curious, she asked, not looking up. Still here. She closed the book. You're not from this part of town. You can tell your shoes cost more than my rent, and you look like you haven't exhaled in years. That made him laugh. The first real one in weeks. He leaned forward. I have a strange question, he said. She raised an eyebrow. I need someone to come with me. To a party. Her smile faded. I don't do strange requests from strange men. It's not what it sounds like. It always is. David paused. This wasn't how it had gone in his head. It's my ex's engagement party, he admitted. And she's expecting me to show up alone. Claire leaned back, arms crossed. So you're recruiting a fake girlfriend? Just one evening, he said. Nothing more. She shook her head slowly. You've got the wrong girl. Why? Because I don't do pretending, she said simply. Not anymore. He nodded, quietly. Fair, he said. Can I ask one more thing? She sighed, but didn't stop him. Why do you come here every morning? She blinked at the shift. Because it's quiet, and no one needs anything from me here. He nodded, understanding that more than he thought he would. You, she asked, surprising him. I'm starting to figure that out. The next morning, he didn't show up, and Claire noticed. She told herself it didn't matter, that people pass through. But as she packed her sketch pad that afternoon, something about the empty chair across from her felt unusually loud. The following day, he returned, but this time he brought something with him. A single folded page, a sketch, her, not perfect, but sincere, her scarf, her tea, the way her hand held a pencil, rendered with hesitation, like it was drawn by someone who never really drew. She looked up at him. You drew this? I tried. Claire stared at it. Then, for the first time, she smiled without guardedness. They sat for an hour. No questions. No plans. Just tea and weather and small pieces of their quiet lives. And before she left, she looked at him and said, I still think your idea is ridiculous. I know. But I might be curious now, too. Claire didn't say yes right away. She said, let me think about it. Which in her world meant maybe, and in David's world meant more than he expected. He gave her his card, clean, white, raised lettering. She laughed when she saw it. You have a card for asking women to play. Pretend he smiled. I have a card for everything. It took her 3 days. She showed up at the same cafe, same table. David was already there, tea in front of him, half sipped. Claire dropped a folded napkin beside his cup. He opened it. Inside was a sketch of a man in a suit, standing at a window, alone. I guess that's a yes, he asked quietly. She nodded once. One night. That's it. They began to prepare. Not rehearsals, exactly, but lunches, walks, conversations that felt like small auditions for a life they didn't live. She asked the hard questions. What was she like? Why did you stay? Why do you care what she thinks now? He didn't flinch. He answered. Claire listened more than she spoke, but what she didn't say said just as much. David took her to a boutique shop, muted lighting, velvet sofas, and champagne no one really drank. Claire tried on dresses like costumes. None felt like her. She stepped out of the changing room in a simple navy gown, rubbing the back of her neck. This is ridiculous, she muttered. David looked up. He had been quiet most of the afternoon. Then he stood, crossed the room slowly, and said, "That one." She frowned. "Too elegant." "You're playing a role," he said, "but you still look like you." Claire tilted her head. "That's either a compliment or a warning. Maybe both." She kept on her leather bracelet, worn, frayed at the ends. David didn't comment on it, just nodded. It stayed on through dinner at his apartment, where she was surprised to find actual ingredients, not just takeout menus. "You cook?" she asked, scanning the countertop. "When I have a reason." She tried chopping onions and nearly lost a finger. He stepped in, guided her hand. Calm, deliberate, no teasing. Their rhythm in the kitchen wasn't perfect, but it was real. They ate on bar stools. The pasta was overcooked, the salad too peppery. "Still," she said, "not bad." And he replied, not pretending, either. They practiced small details: how they met, how long they'd been dating, inside jokes that didn't exist but somehow still made them laugh. Claire leaned on her elbows and said, "You know this is insane, right?" David looked at her for a long moment. "It's just one night." But the way he said it, even he didn't fully believe that anymore. A week passed like a held breath. They met each day not for strategy, but something quieter. Sketches, tea, music on a park bench. No grand confessions. Just the comfort of sharing space. Claire showed him a rooftop she liked to sit on. He showed her a book of poetry he never admitted he read. "Why me?" she asked. Once, as they walked along the river, he didn't answer right away. "Finally," he said, "because you don't try to shine. You just do." She looked away. The wind tugged at her scarf. "You're not afraid of me," he added. Claire laughed softly. "I'm afraid of a lot of things. You're just not one of them." The night before the party, David walked her home. They stood at her stoop, neither quite willing to end the evening. Claire looked at him, the city lights painting soft shadows across her face. "If I see myself turning into someone I don't like," she said, "pull me out." He nodded, voice low. "Deal." The ballroom was gold and cold at the same time. Chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like melting ice. Strings played softly in a corner, the kind of music meant to fill silences without demanding attention. Waiters floated past in black and white. David stood at the entrance, one hand in his pocket, the other adjusting his cuff, his face unreadable. Beside him, Claire exhaled slowly. The forest green gown hugged her in all the right places, but she still felt like she was borrowing someone else's skin. He turned to her. "You ready?" She gave a small nod. "Too late to run." He smiled. "Far too late." They stepped in together. It didn't take long for heads to turn. Claire walked with quiet confidence. She didn't wear diamonds, but she wore grace. No flashy jewelry. Just that worn leather bracelet and the poise of someone who knew herself. Whispers rippled like small waves across the crowd. Who is she? Not his usual type. Where did he find her? Claire heard them. She'd grown used to this kind of gaze, half curiosity, half judgment. But tonight, she didn't flinch. Julia Bennett was at the center of it all. White satin, immaculate hair, a smile practiced in 1,000 mirrors. She turned as they approached. Her eyes flickered over Claire with deliberate slowness. "Well," Julia said, voice syrupy, "you brought someone. I'm impressed." David nodded once. "Didn't want to disappoint. And you are." Julia's eyes didn't move from Claire's bracelet. "Claire Harper," Claire replied evenly. Julia tilted her head. "That's charming." Claire smiled. I've been called worse. Where did you two meet? Julia pressed. Claire glanced at David. He answered first. At a coffee shop. She was drawing strangers. Julia laughed softly. Of course she was. There was a pause. One of those silences too brief to be noticed, too long to be comfortable. Then Julia leaned in a bit closer. She's very different from what I imagined. But I suppose even CEOs need their rebellion phase. Claire's smile didn't fade. I wouldn't call this a phase, she said. I'd call it perspective. They moved on. David kept his hand light on Claire's back as they wove through the room. You okay? He asked quietly. Claire sipped her water. Fine. That woman has claws dipped in champagne. She always did. Claire studied him. And you loved her. David's jaw tightened. I loved who I thought she could be. Later, while David spoke with an old colleague, Claire wandered near the edge of the room. Near the grand window, she saw an older couple dancing slowly, eyes closed. No rhythm, just memory. She smiled, quietly pulled out her sketch pad and began a fast, fluid sketch. Lines, curves. The way the man held her hand like it was still their first dance. Someone watched her. It was Julia. What are you doing? She asked, voice low. Claire didn't look up. Drawing. For who? Claire glanced at the couple. For them. Julia tilted her head. You know, it's very sweet, this whole humble, authentic thing you're doing. Claire met her eyes now. Calm. It's not a thing. Julia stepped closer. He's not going to keep you. You know? This is a phase. A statement. Claire didn't blink. Funny. That's exactly what he told me you were. Julia stiffened. Claire folded the sketch and slipped it into her clutch and walked away. Later that evening, Julia raised her glass mid-toast. David, she called across the room. Since you finally found someone, maybe she'll grace us with something special. Claire looked at David. He was already tense. He shook his head slightly. But Claire stood anyway, walked slowly toward the small stage. A pianist looked up. Do you know Moon River? She asked softly. He nodded. When she began to sing, the room didn't go silent. It stilled, like the whole space inhaled. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't perfect. But it was honest. It trembled in places. It carried every wound and wonder she had lived. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She simply let the music hold her truth. When the last note fell, it left something behind like perfume, like fog, like a memory no one expected. The applause didn't come all at once, but when it did, it wasn't polite. It was real. David stood as she walked back to him. You didn't have to do that, he said, voice low. I wanted to. Why? She looked up at him. Because they needed to hear what real sounds like. And for a moment, David forgot the plan, forgot the act, forgot the room. Because when she looked at him, he wasn't pretending either. The car ride home was quiet, not the kind of silence that follows a fight, not the kind that feels like a wall, but the kind that asks, what do we do with what we're feeling? Claire sat by the window, one hand resting on her lap, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of her bracelet. David kept his eyes on the road. He wasn't avoiding her. He was afraid he might say something too real. The city rolled by in flashes, lights, shadows, brief glimpses of lives not theirs. I didn't mean to make a scene, Claire said softly. You didn't, David replied. You were remarkable. She turned slightly. I didn't sing for them. He glanced at her. I know. They arrived at his apartment, still elegant, still immaculate. But something about it felt softer now. Maybe it was her presence. Maybe it was the memory of her voice filling that ballroom. Claire kicked off her shoes and tucked her feet under her on the couch. David loosened his tie, sat across from her, leaned forward. "Why do you do that?" he asked. "Sing? No? Disarm people?" She tilted her head. "Do I?" He nodded. "You did it to me?" Claire smiled faintly. "Maybe I just see through armor." David looked down at his hands. "I spent years building mine," he said. "Boardroom. Headlines. Distance. I thought that was strength." She watched him quietly. He looked up. "But when you sang tonight, I felt like someone opened a window I didn't realize was sealed shut." Claire didn't respond right away. Then she said, "When my mom was dying, I used to sing to her in the hospital." David sat still, waiting. She couldn't speak much near the end, but she would hum, just barely. "And every time I sang," her eyes softened, she paused. "That's when I knew. Music isn't about being heard. It's about being felt." David's throat tightened. What happened to her breast cancer? Stage 4. Fast. Angry. Claire exhaled. "She died in winter. The kind that freezes bones." A long silence stretched between them. David stood, walked to the kitchen. "Wine," he offered. "I'll take tea." He smiled faintly. "You always choose tea." She shrugged. "Wine numbs. Tea reminds." They sat again, mugs in hand, steam rising like tiny ghosts. Claire looked at him. "You're not over her." "Are you Julia?" he asked, surprised. She nodded. "I'm not in love with her," he said slowly. "But she still knows how to find the cracks." Claire traced her fingertip around the rim of the mug. "That's what the wrong people do best." He leaned forward. "And you? Who cracked you?" She met his eyes, then looked away. "My father." David stayed quiet. "He walked out when I was 12. Said he needed to find himself. Left a note, no goodbye, no number." She swallowed. "I spent years wondering what I did wrong." David's voice was low. "You didn't do anything wrong." Claire gave a sad smile. "Took me decades to believe that." They didn't speak for a while. But the quiet wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, full of stories that never needed to be said out loud. Later, David walked her downstairs. At the lobby, they stood facing each other, too close for comfort, too far for intimacy. "I know this was supposed to be a game," Claire said. "It never was," he replied. She nodded, almost sadly. "Still, it feels like we're pretending something's not happening." David stepped closer. "What if we stopped pretending?" Claire looked up at him, eyes searching. Then she whispered, "I'm scared of falling." He answered, just as quietly, "So am I." They didn't kiss. They didn't promise. But something settled between them. Something real. The elevator chimed softly as Claire stepped out on the 29th floor. She held a paper bag in one hand, warm soup and fresh bread. David had skipped lunch again. She figured he needed more than caffeine and spreadsheets. The receptionist wasn't at her desk. The hallway was quiet, bathed in muted afternoon light. Claire didn't know exactly why she came. Maybe because the night before had felt real. Not like a date, not like a story. Just two people, seen, heard. And now, she was here, wanting to surprise him. She moved quietly toward the office door. It wasn't fully shut. She heard a voice. Female. Controlled. Crisp. "Eleanor." "He's not thinking straight." Claire froze, inside. Eleanor stood by the window, arms crossed, immaculate in navy. Her voice calm but tense beneath the surface. "You've built this company with discipline, David. With precision. And now, you're distracted." David's tone was quieter. I'm not distracted. I'm clear. Eleanor turned, clear about her. A pause. She sings on sidewalks, Eleanor said flatly. She draws strangers. She wears the same shoes every day. And suddenly, she's in the building like she belongs. Claire's fingers tightened around the bag. She's not part of your world, Eleanor added. And you know it. Maybe not consciously, but deep down, you do. David stepped closer to his sister. She's not a risk. She's exactly a risk, Eleanor snapped. Do you know what investors are saying? What our board is whispering? I don't care, he said. Yes, you do. You care because you've spent 20 years making sure no one ever had to question if you belonged in these rooms. Eleanor's voice lowered. She will not survive this world. And if you keep pulling her into it, she will hate you for it. Claire stood still, like someone had pressed pause on her breath. She doesn't belong, Eleanor said again, quiet but final. The bag slipped from Claire's hand. Paper hit tile, a soft thud. A sound too small to mean anything yet loud enough to shatter everything. Inside the room, David turned, but by the time he reached the door, she was gone. She walked fast, didn't wait for the elevator, took the stairs, 2 at a time. Rain had started, thin, sharp, almost invisible. Outside, the wind bit at her cheeks, but she didn't stop, didn't cry. Not yet. David called that night, straight to voicemail. He texted, Claire, please, let's talk. No reply. The next morning, he went to the cafe. Empty. Then the rooftop. The bench near the river. The park where she once hummed quietly while he read poetry he never admitted to owning. Nothing. 3 days passed. Then 5. Then 7. The city moved without her. But David didn't. He canceled meetings. Let voicemails stack. Walked more than he drove. He stood outside the building he knew she lived in, hands in his pockets, watching the windows as if one of them might blink back. But they never did. He returned to his apartment one night and found the napkin she'd once drawn on the sketch of a man standing alone at a window. It had felt charming then. Now, it felt prophetic. Back at the office, Eleanor walked in with a file and a stack of pending signatures. You're late, she said, without judgment. David didn't look up. She set the file down gently. After a moment, she said, You loved her. He didn't answer. Eleanor softened. I didn't mean for it to come out that way. I was trying to protect who David cut in. Voice flat. Me. The company. Your version of our father's legacy. She's not like us. That's exactly why He stopped. Swallowed. That's why she mattered. That night, he returned to the park. The bench under the oak tree. The one where Claire once said, I sing for anyone who needs to feel a little less alone. He sat there until dark, then opened his wallet. Inside was a small folded sketch she had once given him. It wasn't a portrait of his face. It was him cooking, laughing, looking free. Not the CEO, just the man underneath. David looked out across the quiet park, then whispered almost to himself, I'm sorry I let them speak louder than my heart. And in the stillness, for the first time in years, he cried. The city didn't notice she was gone. The traffic still howled down Fifth Avenue. Coffee shops still served espresso with practiced speed. People still ran for trains, talked into phones, laughed into the void. But David did. Everywhere he turned, she wasn't there. He returned to the cafe first. The seat by the window was taken by someone new young, typing too loudly. No sketch pad in sight. The server asked if he wanted his usual. He said no, and left. He checked the rooftop Claire once showed him. locked. He walked to the old bookstore where she'd mentioned she liked to browse sheet music. The man behind the counter shook his head. Haven't seen her in a while. You okay? Buddy David didn't answer. He just nodded and left. Back at the office, everything felt sterile. The air colder, the walls sharper. Eleanor kept her distance. They spoke in clipped phrases, signatures, timelines, logistics, but not once about Claire. David didn't ask, and she didn't explain. He wasn't angry. Not anymore. He was just empty. One night, unable to sleep, he returned to his apartment's small balcony and stared at the skyline. The same view Claire had once said reminded her of piano keys, white lights, and dark gaps. She had a way of making things feel poetic without trying. He missed that. He missed her. The next morning, he sat on the bench in the park under the old oak tree, the same place where Claire once said, I sing for the invisible people, the ones who feel like background noise. She had meant it. David closed his eyes and tried to remember her voice. Not the polished version from the party, the one from that first dinner. When she sang half a melody between chopping onions, when she laughed and called salt chaos seasoning, he smiled at the memory, then opened his eyes, and she still wasn't there. He tried calling again, once, twice, left a voicemail. Claire, I don't expect you to respond. I'm sorry, and not just for what you heard. He paused. I'm sorry for how long it took me to realize what you meant to me. Click. Weeks passed. David showed up to work, but barely. He skipped meetings, ignored emails, spent too long staring at documents without reading a word. The team noticed. They whispered, but no one asked, except one man, Joseph, an older board member who had known David since his 20s. They met in the conference room one afternoon. Joseph looked at him with eyes that didn't judge. You're not losing focus, he said. You're grieving. David looked up. Grieving what a future you didn't fight for. That night, David wandered the city. No plan, no direction. He passed murals, buskers, streetlights flickering above puddles. Then he heard something. Music. Soft, raw, familiar. It pulled at him not in sound, but in memory. He turned toward the alley, where a small community event was underway. Lanterns strung from poles, kids running with painted faces, and a small wooden stage. He froze. It was her. Claire stood under the canopy of light, wearing a simple blue dress. No makeup, hair tied back, guitar in hand, eyes closed, singing. Her voice hadn't changed, but something in it had deepened. It was steadier now, still aching but rooted. She wasn't singing to prove anything. She was just being. David moved closer, slow, step by step, through the crowd. When her eyes opened, she saw him. She didn't stop, but her voice caught just slightly, and he knew. She hadn't stopped feeling either. When the song ended, the applause came like a wave, but David stepped forward, didn't wait. He looked up at her from the foot of the stage, and he spoke. Claire, he said, voice strong, though his hands shook. I told you once to help me pretend to fool a room into believing we were in love. A beat of silence. But the only person I fooled was me. The crowd stilled. Claire didn't move. I thought I needed someone to play a part. What I didn't realize was I needed someone to show me what's real again. He took a breath. And I let you go. Because I was scared you'd realize I wasn't enough. Her eyes shimmered. He stepped closer. I don't care where you sing. I don't care what shoes you wear. I only care about how I feel when I hear your voice, and how I see myself when I'm with you. A long pause. Then Claire gently placed her guitar down, walked to the edge of the stage, one step, then another, until she stood right in front of him. She didn't say anything. She just fell into his arms. The crowd erupted in applause again, but neither of them noticed. They were holding too tightly. The rooftop wasn't grand. It wasn't lined with marble or surrounded by city lights twinkling like a movie scene. It was simple. Strands of fairy lights hung between pipes, a few folding chairs, a speaker that crackled when turned too loud, but it felt like magic anyway. Claire stood in the doorway, looking at it all soft golden light, a small wooden stage, and David, standing at the center, waiting. He turned when he heard her footsteps, gave a nervous half smile. "I rented it for the night," he said. "Figured if I couldn't bring you into my world, maybe I could step into yours." Claire blinked. "Just for me," David shook his head. "For you to be you, and for me to remember why I fell for that in the first place." She didn't speak. Instead, she walked toward the stage, sat down, and cradled the guitar like something familiar, something that still belonged to her. David stepped back, gave her space. Claire played the first chord slowly, then began to sing. The song wasn't perfect. It wasn't practiced, but it was honest. It was about stillness, about being lost and then found not with maps or miracles, but with someone choosing to stay. She didn't look at him until the last verse. Then her eyes found his and stayed. When the final note faded, the wind carried the silence. David walked up slowly, stopped just in front of her. "I missed you," he said simply. "I didn't want you to find me," she replied. "Not if you were going to be the same." "I'm not," he said. "At least, I'm trying not to be." Claire looked down. "It's not about effort, David. It's about intention." He nodded. "Then let me show you mine." They sat on the edge of the rooftop, legs dangling, shoulders barely touching. Claire pulled her coat tighter around her. "I'm scared," she admitted. David looked at her. Of what? Of being seen. And then being left. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm scared of being seen and not knowing what to do with it." She let out a quiet laugh. "We're a fine pair." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded paper creased from being opened too many times. It was the sketch she gave him. Him, cooking, laughing. Not CEO David, just David. "I look at this," he said, "and I see the man I want to be. The one who doesn't measure his life in quarterly reports." Claire's eyes softened. "That man exists. I've seen him. Then I want to live like he's real." Silence settled again, but it wasn't hollow. It was filled with something neither of them dared name too soon. The next day, they returned to the small cafe. The barista grinned when he saw them. "Been a while," he said to Claire. She smiled, a little sheepishly. "Had some songs to write." David ordered tea for both of them. No hesitation. Claire raised an eyebrow. "No more black coffee." He smiled. "Tea reminds." That evening, he walked her to her apartment. At the door, she paused, turned to him. "I'm not promising easy," she said. David shook his head. "I'm not asking for easy, just real." She nodded, then leaned in. A gentle kiss. No fireworks, just quiet certainty. When she pulled back, she whispered, "That was not pretending." He smiled. "I know." Later that night, Claire sat alone by her window. She stared at the city, guitar resting beside her, and for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Not because someone fixed everything, but because someone stayed. The neighborhood had changed. not in buildings, but in rhythm. The corner where sirens used to echo now held the sound of children's laughter. The alley once filled with graffiti and cracked bricks now shimmered with music on Saturdays. And right in the center of it all stood a small converted warehouse. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Claire's Music Corner." Inside, the air smelled of old wood, sheet music, and something sweet like hope. Children sat cross-legged on a rug. Ukuleles too big for their arms. Some clapped in rhythm, others hummed off-key, but all were welcome. No audition, no tuition, only curiosity. At the front, Claire knelt beside a young girl whose fingers trembled on a chord. "Breathe first," she whispered, "then play." The girl smiled, tried again. A soft, wobbly note emerged. Claire beamed, behind the glass. David watched from outside, a cup of coffee in hand, a notebook under his arm. He didn't interrupt. He rarely did. This was her world now, but he belonged in it quietly, steadily. When class ended, Claire stepped outside, found him leaning against the door frame, hair a little grayer than when they met, eyes a little softer. "You're early," she said, brushing a curl from her face. "Got inspired," he replied, tapping the notebook. She raised an eyebrow. "More lyrics." "Maybe," Claire laughed. "You know you're still terrible with rhymes." He smiled. "But I'm great with bridges." They walked together down the block. The bakery owner waved. A kid on a scooter almost ran into them. Claire laughed. David shielded her with his shoulder. Just little things. But they mattered now. At home, just 2 rooms and a narrow balcony. They cooked dinner like they always did. Claire burned the garlic. David didn't say a word. Just opened the window and poured her a glass of sparkling water. Later, she sang as he cleaned the dishes. No stage, no audience. Just evening rehearsal, as they called it. One weekend, the neighborhood hosted a small concert in the park. Nothing fancy, just families, picnic blankets, and string lights swaying in the breeze. Claire took the makeshift stage. David sat in the middle row. No name tag, no title, just jeans and a folded program in his back pocket. She scanned the crowd, found him in an instant, and smiled. She sang a new song, not about heartbreak, not even about healing, but about stillness. About coming home to a place you never thought you'd belong. Her voice wrapped around the audience like a slow blanket. Children quieted, couples leaned closer, and David, he didn't move. He didn't need to, because he was already there. When the final note drifted into the night air, the crowd clapped warmly. Claire bowed, but her eyes never left David. After the concert, they stayed behind as volunteers packed up chairs. Claire sat on the edge of the stage, legs swinging, guitar in her lap. David joined her, didn't speak, just reached out, took her hand. The leather bracelet still circled her wrist, frayed, familiar, real. She looked at him. "You okay?" He nodded. "Better than okay." Then added, "I used to chase things that made me feel important, but you make me feel present." Claire squeezed his hand. "You always belong somewhere," she said. "You just needed to stop running." Later that night, back on their tiny balcony, Claire strummed a few quiet chords. David wrote something in his notebook. She peeked over, read aloud. "She used to be a voice in the crowd. Now she's the reason I never want to leave the room." Claire smiled, rested her head on his shoulder. "I like that one." He kissed her hair. "I like this life." It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was enough. Some love stories don't end with grand gestures. They end with a hand held over a quiet dinner, with music shared on a rooftop no one else sees. with two people saying, "I choose you," even when the world says they shouldn't. Claire and David's story is a reminder that love isn't about the world's permission. It's about connection, about finding someone who sees who you are beneath the layers and stays. But it's also a mirror. How often do we judge someone's worth by what they wear, what they earn, or where they fit? How many stories like Claire's are cut short not by lack of love, but by the fear of not belonging? Let this story challenge us to love deeper, to see clearer, to stand beside the people who bring us back to ourselves no matter how different their world may look. If this story moved you, made you reflect, or reminded you of someone you love, please like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Because here, we tell the stories that hold you close, and maybe, just maybe help you see the world a little softer. We'll see you in the next story.